Hello everyone and welcome back. In today's teaching, we're going to be considering the anatomy of the ureter. And if you are yet to subscribe to my YouTube channel, kindly do so. It helps the algorithm, and don't also forget to turn on post notification. So let's go to the ureter. Now, the ureter is a narrow muscular tube that carries urine from the kidney to the urinary bladder. Now, in one of our classes, we discussed the anatomy of the kidneys. And if you've not done that, please check the videos out. And in that class, we mentioned that the ureter is that tube that connects the kidney to the urinary bladder. But then for this class, we're going to be discussing the ureter majorly. Now, as earlier said, the ureter is a muscular tube that carries urine from the kidney to the urinary bladder. And humans have two ureters, one from each of the kidney. Now, the length of the ureter is about 25 to 30 centimeter long, and it has three parts. Now, the first part is the abdominal part, the second part is the pelvic part, and the third part is the intramural part. So let's start by discussing this part one after the other. But before then, let us consider this diagram and talk about the labelings. Now, here is the kidney, here's the kidney, and here is the renal pelvis. Renal pelvis, this is the kidney, then this part is the renal pelvis. Now, the structure labeled black all through its course is the ureter. Then these red and blue structures, they are the gonadal vessels. This shaded black region is the psoas major muscle. Here we have at the junction where the ureter crosses the pelvic brim. Then this is the bladder. So let's talk about the parts. Now, the first part of the ureter that we'll be discussing is the abdominal part. Now, let's consider this diagram and use it in explaining the abdominal part of the ureter. Now, for the abdominal part of the ureter, it begins at the renal pelvis. The abdominal part of the ureter begins at the renal pelvis, and it descends vertically downward on the psoas major muscle. So once again, it begins at the renal pelvis, it descends vertically on the psoas major muscle, and it is also crossed by the gonadal vessels. So once again, the abdominal part of the ureter begins at the renal pelvis, it descends vertically on the psoas major muscle, and it is crossed by the gonadal vessels, this structure labeled blue and red. And also, at this junction, it crosses the pelvic brim at the bifurcation of the common iliac artery. So essentially, the abdominal part starts from the renal pelvis, descends downward, crossed by the gonadal vessels, and also crosses the pelvic brim at the bifurcation of the common iliac artery. So from here to here is the abdominal part of the ureter. So let's talk about the pelvic parts. So at the pelvic part, it enters the true pelvis. That is here. It enters the true pelvis, and it runs along the lateral pelvic wall. It enters the true pelvis, runs along the lateral pelvic wall, and approaches the urinary bladder. So that means from this junction to this junction is the pelvic part. From here to here is the abdominal part. From here to here is the pelvic part. So let's discuss the last parts of the ureter, which is the intramural part. So in the intramural part, it passes through the wall of the urinary bladder. This structure labeled red, the structure on red is the urinary bladder. So in the intramural part, it passes through the wall of urinary bladder and opens into the bladder obliquely. So once again, the ureter begins at the renal pelvis, descends downward on the psoas major muscle, crossed by the gonadal vessels, and here it crosses the pelvic brim as the bifurcation of the common iliac artery to enter into the true pelvis to now become the pelvic part. It runs along lateral pelvic wall, approaches the urinary bladder, and once it is inside, it becomes the intramural part. So let's talk about the relations. The anterior relation of the ureter, the gonadal vessels, and the peritoneum, while the posterior relation is the psoas major muscle and the genitofemoral nerve. So let's go to constrictions of the ureter. And what are constrictions? Constrictions are those junctions. They are natural narrow points where the ureter's diameter gets reduced. So these constrictions of the ureter, there are three natural narrow points. along the ureter where its diameter gets reduced. And we have 3 of them in the ureter. First one is the ureteropelvic junction. The second one is at the junction where it crosses the pelvic brim. And the third one is the ureterovesical junction. And these constrictions, these junctions, they are common sites for ureteric stones, and blockage of these sites can prevent urine flow. So let's use this diagram in explaining the constrictions of the ureter. So we said that the first one is at the ureteropelvic junction, and this junction is ureteropelvic junction. This junction is the ureteropelvic junction. Then the second one is at a level where it crosses the pelvic brim. If you recall earlier, this part was labeled in the former diagram. So this junction is also one of the constrictions of the ureter. Then the last part is the ureterovesical junction. Between that part, between the ureter and the vesicle. Now let's move straight to the blood supply of the ureter, blood supply to the ureter. Now, the blood supply to that is the renal artery, the gonadal artery, the common iliac artery, and the vesical artery. And the nerve supply is by the renal plexus and the aortic plexus. The venous drainage is the corresponding vein to these arteries. And the clinical anatomy is ureteric stones and hydronephrosis. Now, I believe that with this, you understand the anatomy of the ureter. Please don't forget to subscribe, and if you have any questions, drop them in the comment section. Thank you so much, and see you in the next class.